$50. Zeke's voice cracked like a whip across the dusty courthouse steps, silencing the jeering crowd. His weathered hand clutched a roll of crumpled bills every cent. He owned in this godforsaken world. Margot's emerald eyes met his. Through the iron bars of the makeshift auction platform, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. The debt collector, a weasel-faced man named Cornelius Grimm, seized her father's ranch for unpaid taxes and was selling everything including her. Bound by some twisted legal loophole that treated her as property alongside the livestock. 60 hollered Brutus Hawthorne, the town's most feared cattle baron, his gold teeth glinting in the harsh noon sun. His meaty fists clenched as he eyed Margot like a prized heifer. Zeke's jaw tightened. He'd worked 3 years breaking horses for old man Fletcher, saved every penny, dreaming of buying his own spread. That dream money was all that stood between Margot and a fate worse than death. 75, Zeke countered, his voice steady. Despite the earthquake in his chest, Grimm's gavel hovered in the air. 75 from the cowpoke. Do I hear 100? Hawthorne's voice boomed like thunder. The crowd gasped. Zeke's heart plummeted. He had exactly $87 to his name. His calloused fingers worked through the bills again. Hoping against hope, he'd miscounted. Margot's father, Jedediah Ashworth, had been Zeke's mentor before consumption claimed him last winter. On his deathbed, the old rancher had gripped Zeke's wrists with surprising strength. "Promise me, boy," he'd wheezed. "If anything happens to my Margot, you'll protect her. She's got fire in her soul, but a gentle heart. This world will try to break both." Now, watching Hawthorne's triumphant sneer, Zeke felt that promise burning in his gut like prairie fire. "Going once," Grimm called out. Zeke stepped forward, his spurs jangling against the wooden steps. "Wait." His voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced down stampeding cattle and rabid wolves. "I challenge the legality of this auction." Nervous murmurs rippled through the crowd. Grimm's face reddened. "There's nothing illegal about collecting debts, cowboy." "There is when you're selling a free citizen," Zeke shot back. "Margot ain't. Chattel? She's got rights." "It's not when she's bound to the property as collateral," Hawthorne growled, stepping closer. "Her daddy signed papers making her part of the ranch's assets. It's all legal and proper." Zeke's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip. "Over my dead body?" The crowd backed away, sensing the electricity in the air. Hawthorne's 3 hired guns shifted their positions, hands hovering near their weapons. Margot pressed herself against the bars. "Zeke, don't," she whispered urgently. "They'll kill you." But Zeke was already calculating odds, distances, angles. He'd been in tighter spots during his years riding the circuit. The key was not to outdraw them, was to outthink them. "Tell you what, Hawthorne," Zeke said, his voice deceptively casual. "How about we settle this the old way? Winner takes all." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "What kind of contest?" Zeke smiled grimly. "Your choice? Cards, fists, or guns? But if I win, Margot goes free, and you forget all about this auction." The cattle baron considered this, his cruel mind already working the angles. He had money, men, and influence. What could one broken-down cowboy possibly offer as a threat? "And if you lose?" Hawthorne asked. "Then I'll throw in my horse, my gear, and work your ranch for free for 5 years." The deal was too good to refuse. The poker game was set for midnight in the back room of Sullivan's saloon. With half the town crammed in to witness what everyone knew would be Zeke's funeral, Hawthorne had brought his best card sharp, a skeletal man called Viper, Morrison who could deal seconds with the dexterity of a surgeon and the morals of a rattlesnake. Margot sat in the corner, still shackled but no longer on the auction block. Her eyes never left Zeke's face as he studied his cards with the same intensity he'd once used to read storm clouds on the horizon. "Raise 20, Viper hissed, pushing chips forward with pale, spider-like fingers. Zeke had started with his $87. Through careful play and reading tells, he'd built it up to nearly 200. No, but Hawthorne's man had been playing longer than Zeke had been alive, and the stakes kept climbing. "Call," Zeke said quietly, matching the bet. 3 hours in, sweat. beaded on Zeke's forehead despite the cool night air. Hawthorne lounged in a leather chair, sipping whiskey and enjoying the show. His victory seemed assured until Zeke started winning hands he had no business winning. The truth was, Jedediah Ashworth had taught Zeke more than just horse-breaking during those long winter nights. The old rancher had been a riverboat gambler in his youth, and he'd shown Zeke how to read the subtle language of cards and men. "The secret ain't the cards," boy Jedediah had said, shuffling a worn deck by firelight. "It's understanding that every man's got a weakness. Find it and you can beat him with a pair of twos." Now watching Viper's unconscious habit of touching his left ear before bluffing, Zeke began to see the pattern. The man was good, but he was also predictable. "Raise 50, Zeke said, blissing forward a substantial portion of his winnings. Viper's hand twitched toward his ear, then stopped. Too late. Zeke had seen enough. "Told," the card sharp muttered. Hawthorne's confidence began to crack. "What the hell are you doing, Viper? He's just a cowpuncher." But Zeke wasn't just any cowpuncher anymore. He was a man with everything to lose and nothing left to fear. That combination made him dangerous in ways Hawthorne was only beginning to understand. Crowd pressed closer as the pile of money in the center of the table grew. Outside, thunder rumbled ominously, promising the kind of storm that could wash away more than just dust. "All in," Viper declared suddenly, shoving his remaining chips forward. It was a desperate play designed to force Zeke out of the hand. Zeke looked at his cards, a pair of queens. Good, but not great. Then he looked at Viper's face, saw the micro-expression of doubt that flickered across those cold features for just an instant. "Call," Zeke said, pushing forward every dollar he owned. Viper's triumphant smile faltered as he revealed his hand a pair of jacks. The saloon erupted. Zeke had won not just the hand, but enough money to buy Margot's freedom twice over. Face went purple with rage. "You cheated?" the cattle baron roared, lunging to his feet. "Prove it," Zeke said calmly, gathering the money. "Your man dealt every hand." But as Zeke stood to leave, Hawthorne's hired guns blocked the door. The cattle baron's fury had overcome his business sense. "Nobody leaves until I say so," Hawthorne snarled. Zeke's hand moved to his gun, but 3 barrels were already trained on him. In the sudden silence, Margot's voice rang out clear and strong. "Let him go, Brutus! You lost fair and square? Shut your mouth, woman. You're still mine by law." That's when Zeke noticed something that made his blood run cold. While everyone had been focused on the card game, more of Hawthorne's men had quietly surrounded the building. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about power, pride, and the kind of evil that festered in men who'd never been told. No. Thunder crashed overhead as the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain hammered against the saloon's tin roof like bullets as Hawthorne's men closed in. Zeke counted 6 guns pointed at him, not including Hawthorne's own pearl-handled Remington. The crowd had pressed back against the walls, leaving him alone in a circle of death. "You think you're clever, don't you, cowboy?" Hawthorne sneered. His facade of civility completely dropped. "Nobody makes a fool of me in my own town." Zeke kept his hands visible, his mind racing. The oil lamps cast dancing shadows that might provide cover, but not enough. He needed a distraction, something to even the odds. "Funny thing about being made a fool of," Zeke drawled, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who'd stared down charging bulls. "Usually happens when a man's already acting like one." Hawthorne's trigger finger twitched. "Last words, cowpoke?" That's when Margot surprised everyone. The shackles that had bound her wrists suddenly clattered to the floor sheet. "Been working at the lock with a hairpin throughout the entire poker game?" In one fluid motion, she grabbed a bottle from the nearest table and hurled it at the oil lamp above Hawthorne's head. The lamp exploded in a shower of glass and flame. Burning oil splashed across the cattle baron's expensive suit, sending him screaming and rolling on the floor. In the sudden chaos of darkness and fire, Zeke moved. His Colt cleared leather as he dove behind the overturned poker table. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, his and Viper Morrison's. The card sharp spun, and he crashed into the bar, clutching his shoulder. Zeke's bullet had found its mark. Get the lights back up. Hawthorne roared, batting at the flames on his jacket. But Margot was already moving, kicking over another lamp. More flames spread across the wooden floor, creating a maze of fire and shadow. The hired guns fired wildly into the darkness, their muzzle flashes revealing their positions. Zeke rolled left, came up firing. A second gunman dropped with a cry of pain. The odds were improving, but not fast enough. "This way," Margot called out, having found a back door hidden behind a curtain. Zeke provided covering fire as she yanked it open, revealing the rain-soaked alley behind the saloon. They burst through together, Zeke's strong arm around her waist as bullets splintered the doorframe behind them. "My horse is at the livery," he panted, pulling her through the muddy streets. "They'll be watching it," Margot said, her mind sharp, despite the chaos. "But I know another way out of town." She led him through a maze of back alleys and drainage ditches, her knowledge of Willowbrook's hidden passages proving invaluable. Behind them, they could hear Hawthorne organizing a search party, his voice carrying over the storm. "Burn the whole damn town down if you have to. I want them alive." They reached the old mine shaft on the edge of town just as the search party's torches appeared in the distance. The mine had been abandoned for years, but Margot remembered playing in its upper tunnels as a child. "It connects to the cave system near Copper Creek," she explained as they descended into the darkness. "We can come out 5 miles south of town." Tunnel was narrow and treacherous, filled with loose rocks and sudden drop-offs. Zeke's hands found Margot's in the darkness, and for the first time since the auction, she allowed herself to lean on his strength. "Why?" she whispered, as they navigated a particularly tight passage. "Why risk everything for me?" Zeke was quiet for so long that Margot thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Your father made me promise to protect you, but that ain't the real reason." "What is?" "Because I've been in love with you since the first day I saw you gentling that wild Mustang. You had such patience, such kindness. I knew then that you were the only woman I'd ever want to spend my life with." They emerged from the caves as dawn was breaking, soaked and exhausted but alive. In the distance, they could see the smoke rising. From Willowbrook, Hawthorne's rage had indeed led to buildings burning, but they were free. And they had the money from the poker game. It was enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere Hawthorne's influence couldn't reach them. "We go?" Margot asked, shivering in the cool morning air. Zeke pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "West, I'm thinking. Oregon Territory. I hear they're giving away land to folks willing to work it." She looked up at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not just the cowboy who'd worked for her father, but the man who'd risked everything for love. "Zeke Brannigan," she said softly, "are you asking me to marry you?" His weathered face broke into a grin that could have lit up the entire territory. "Yes, ma'am. I surely am." 3 weeks later, their stolen happiness came to an abrupt end. Zeke was chopping wood behind the small cabin they had rented in the mountain town of Pineview when he heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. His blood turned to ice as he recognized the rider in the lead Cornelius Grimm, the debt collector, followed by 6 hard-faced men wearing deputy badges that looked suspiciously new. "Ezekiel Brannigan," Grimm called out in his nasal voice. "No. Under arrest for theft, assault, arson, and kidnapping." Zeke's axe remained steady in his hands. Through the cabin window, he could see Margot frozen at the wash basin, her face pale with fear. "Theft of what?" Zeke asked calmly, though his mind was already calculating escape routes. "The money you stole from Mr. Hawthorne's poker game. He's filed a complaint with the territorial marshal, claiming you and your accomplice cheated him out of $300. That money was won fair and square. Half the town saw it." Grimm's smile was as oily as his hair. "Witnesses Brannigan. They tend to remember things differently when their livelihoods depend on Mr. Hawthorne's good graces." The truth hit Zeke like a sledgehammer. Hawthorne owned Willowbrook the businesses, the sheriff probably half the territorial government. He'd simply bought himself a legal way to get revenge. "The woman comes with us too," one of the fake deputies added, his hand resting on his gun butt. "She's wanted for destroying property, and assaulting a peace officer, like hell she is, Zeke snarled, raising the axe. The confrontation might have turned bloody right then. But Margot stepped out of the cabin with her hands raised. It's all right, Zeke. Let them take us. We'll fight this in court. There ain't gonna be any court, Zeke said grimly. As soon as we're out of sight of this town, they'll put bullets in our backs and claim we were trying to escape. Margot's eyes met his, and he saw that she understood. But she also saw something he'd missed: the old mountain man named Tobias Ironwood watching from his porch across the valley. His ancient Sharps rifle cradled in his arms. Mr. Grimm, she called out sweetly, before you arrest us, shouldn't you show us your warrant? It was a brilliant stall tactic. While Grimm fumbled through his saddlebags, Tobias was already moving with surprising speed for a man past 70. He'd lived through the mountain wars and knew the difference between real law and hired guns. The warrant. When Grimm finally produced it, was obviously forged. The seal was wrong. It was signed by a judge who'd been dead for 2 years. But Grimm was counting on them not knowing such details. Satisfied, he sneered, "Now come along quietly and maybe you'll live to see trial." That's when Tobias's voice rang out across the valley like the crack of doom. You're gonna think so, you yellow-bellied varmints. The old mountain man had reached the ridge overlooking the cabin, and his Sharps rifle was aimed directly at Grimm's chest. At that range, the massive .50 caliber bullet would punch clean through a man and his horse. "This here's a legal township," Tobias continued, his voice carrying with the authority of someone who'd helped write the territorial laws. "You want to arrest folks? You best have real badges and real warrants. That paper you're waving ain't worth the powder to blow it up." Fake deputies began to spread out, but Tobias had brought friends. More rifles appeared on ridges around the valley, other old-timers who'd settled in Pinot View specifically to get away from corrupt lawmen and cattle barons. "You're interfering with official business," Grimm protested, though his confidence was cracking. "Show me one official thing about this business," Tobias shot back. "Your badges are tin, your warrant's a forgery, and you're working for a man who don't have jurisdiction spit in this territory." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Zeke used the distraction to edge closer to Margot, the axe still ready in his hands. Then everything went to hell when one of the fake deputies, nerves frayed beyond endurance, drew his gun and fired. At Tobias, the old mountain man's Sharps boomed like a cannon, and the fake deputy sailed backwards off his horse. The other rifles around the valley opened up, and suddenly the air was full of lead and smoke. Zeke grabbed Margot's hand and dove for the cover of their cabin as bullets whined overhead. Grimm's horse reared and threw him, sending the debt collector scrambling for cover behind a water trough. "We've got to get out of here," Margot shouted over the gunfire. But Zeke was already thinking ahead. This battle would end eventually, but Hawthorne's reach was long. They needed more than just to escape. They needed to end this permanently. "No," he said, his jaw set with determination. "We're going back. To Willowbrook. It's time to finish this." The return journey to Willowbrook took them 4 days through treacherous mountain passes. But they weren't alone. Tobias Ironwood and 5 of his grizzled companions had insisted on coming along there. Long rifles and longer grudges against corrupt authority, making them formidable allies. "Hawthorne's got himself a private army now," Tobias warned as they made camp on the ridge overlooking the town. "Word is he's hired 20 gunfighters from as far away as Dodge City. Place looks like an armed camp." Through his spyglass, Zeke could see the truth of it. Armed men patrolled the streets, and sandbag fortifications had been thrown up around Hawthorne's mansion on the hill. The cattle baron had essentially declared war on anyone who might challenge his authority. "Scared," Margot observed, studying the town through her own borrowed spyglass. "Look how he's barricaded himself in. A confident man doesn't need that much protection." She was right. Hawthorne's overreaction revealed weakness, but it also made their task nearly impossible. 7 people, no matter how skilled, couldn't assault a fortified position held by 20 professional gunmen. "We need to be smarter than him," Zeke mused, watching the patrol patterns. "Hit him where he doesn't expect it." That night, as they huddled around a smokeless fire, Margot revealed a secret she'd kept even from her father. During her childhood explorations of the town, she'd discovered a network of old mining tunnels that ran beneath Willowbrook's main street. The entrance was hidden in the basement of the abandoned church at the town's edge. They connect to the storm drains under Hawthorne's mansion, she explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt. During heavy rains, water used to flood his wine cellar until he had the drains expanded. Tobias studied the map with the eye of someone who'd fought in places where knowing the terrain meant the difference between victory and a shallow grave. Could work, he admitted grudgingly. But it's a death trap if they discover us down there. Only one way in, one way out. Not necessarily, Margot said, her eyes bright with a dangerous plan. What if we made our own way out? She explained her idea. And even the battle-hardened mountain men whistled in appreciation. It was audacious, risky, and just crazy enough to work. The next morning, while Zeke and the others prepared for the underground assault, Margot rode openly into Willowbrook under a flag of truce. She dressed in her finest remaining clothes and arranged her hair to look like the sophisticated Eastern ladies Hawthorne, Kay admired. The guards at his mansion were suspicious but ultimately let her pass. After all, what threat could one woman pose? Hawthorne received her in his opulent study, surrounded by his hired guns. He'd changed since their last encounter. His face bore burned scars from the saloon fire, and his eyes held the manic gleam of a man who'd let obsession consume his sanity. "Come to surrender yourself, my dear?" he asked with poisonous courtesy. "I've come to make you an offer," Margot replied calmly. "A trade." She opened a leather satchel and poured the poker winnings onto his mahogany desk. "Every dollar Zeke had. Won that night. The money you claim we stole, plus interest. $350. In exchange, you call off this manhunt and let us leave the territory in peace." Hawthorne's laugh was like breaking glass. "My sweet innocent child. This stopped being about money the moment you humiliated me in front of the entire town. Now, it's about respect. Fear. Making sure nobody else gets ideas about defying Brutus Hawthorne." He stood and walked to the window, gazing down at his armed kingdom. "I'm going to make an example of your cowboy that'll be talked about from here to California, when you, my dear, are going to watch every minute of it before I decide what to do with you." While Hawthorne gloated, Margot was counting his men and memorizing the room's layout. More importantly, she was buying time for Zeke to get into position deep beneath the mansion. Zeke and the mountain men had successfully navigated the flooded tunnels. They emerged in Hawthorne's wine cellar just as planned, water dripping from their clothes and weapons ready. But the hardest part was still ahead of them. The wine cellar was a maze of oak, barrels and stone archways, lit by a few flickering oil lamps. Zeke signaled his companions to spread out as they heard footsteps and voices from the mansion above. Hawthorne was showing off his domain to Margot, unaware that death was creeping up from below. "Remember," Tobias whispered, his grizzled face. "Grim in the lamplight, we take Hawthorne alive if possible." Dead men can't call off their hired guns. They crept up the servants' stairs, their boots silent on the worn wooden steps. At the top, Zeke peered through a crack in the door and saw 2 guards lounging in the kitchen, playing cards and drinking Hawthorne's whiskey. The mountain men moved like ghosts. Within seconds, both guards were unconscious on the floor, bound and gagged with strips torn from kitchen towels. No shots fired. No alarm raised. The real challenge lay ahead. The main staircase to Hawthorne's study was guarded by 4 more men, and the approach offered no cover. That's when they heard Margot's voice carrying down from above, sweet and concerned. "Mr. Hawthorne, you seem to have injured yourself. There's blood on your collar." "Blood?" Hawthorne's voice was sharp with alarm. "Where?" "Just here. Let me help you." The sound of scuffling came from the study, followed by a man's startled cry. Margot had struck, probably with a letter opener or paperweight. The guards at the staircase looked at each other in confusion. "Should we?" one began. "Stay at your posts," Hawthorne roared from above. "The little hellcat tried to stab me, but she's secured now." But the distraction had been enough. Zeke and his men used the confusion to reach the top of the stairs. When the guards turned back to their posts, they found themselves staring down the barrels of 6 deadly rifles. "Surrender or die," Tobias said simply. "Your choice." These were professionals, not the town drunks Hawthorne usually intimidated. They recognized superior firepower when they saw it, and wisely laid down their arms. Zeke kicked open the study door to find Hawthorne holding a bleeding arm while pointing a derringer at Margot's head. She sat tied to a chair, a thin line of blood trickling from her lip where he'd struck her. "One step closer, and she dies," Hawthorne snarled. "Pull that trigger and you die 2 seconds later." Zeke replied calmly, his Colt steady in his hands. "Your choice, but choose quick." My fingers getting mighty tired. For a moment, the room balanced on the edge of violence. Then Hawthorne's nerve broke. The derringer clattered to the floor as he raised his hands in surrender. "It's over, Zeke," said, moving to untie Margot. "Call off your men." Hawthorne's smile was pure poison. "Oh, it's far from over, Cowboy. You think 20 hired guns are just going to ride away because you caught me? They've got contracts to fulfill and reputations to maintain." As if summoned by his words, they heard the thunder of hoofbeats in the courtyard below. Someone had finally discovered the unconscious guards, and now the entire hired army was converging on the mansion. "Looks like we're trapped," one of the mountain men observed grimly. Hawthorne's laughter filled the room. "That's right. It's trapped like rats in my own house. And my boys will smoke you out or burn you out, but either way, you're all dead men." Through the window, they could see gunmen taking positions around the mansion. The siege had begun, but Margot was smiling, and that made Zeke suspicious. She had that look she got when she was about to do something dangerous and brilliant. "What aren't you telling us?" he asked quietly. Her smile widened. "Remember that second way out I mentioned? I didn't just discover it as a child, I improved it." She pointed to an ornate bookshelf against the far wall. "Help me move this." Behind the bookshelf was a door that opened onto a narrow balcony overlooking the mansion's rear gardens. But that wasn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part was the rope and pulley. System she'd rigged years ago for midnight adventures, complete with a zip line that ran all the way down the hill to the old church. "You magnificent woman," Zeke breathed, pulling her into his arms for a fierce kiss. But Hawthorne wasn't finished. Even tied up and defeated, his hatred burned like acid. "You can run, but you'll never be safe. I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." Tobias solved the problem by stuffing a gag in the cattle baron's mouth. "Shut up, you windbag. Ain't running anywhere." He was right. It was time to end this permanently. The zip line carried them safely to the old church, but instead of fleeing into the night as Hawthorne's men expected, Zeke led his small army back through the mining tunnels toward the town's center. Margot's intimate knowledge of Willowbrook's hidden passages allowed them to move like ghosts beneath the streets. They emerged in the basement of Doc Henley's medical practice, startling the old physician who was tending to a patient by lamplight. "It's great. Thundering Moses," Doc Henley exclaimed, nearly dropping his surgical instruments. "Zeke, Margot." "What in tarnation, Doc? We need your help," Zeke said urgently. "How many folks in town are tired of living under Hawthorne's boot?" The physician's eyes hardened. "More than you might think. That madman's been bleeding this town dry for years, and his hired killers have been terrorizing decent folk."
What?
"Can we do against 20 professional gunfighters?" "What if those gunfighters suddenly found themselves outnumbered 5-1? Margot asked. While Zeke and the mountain men had been infiltrating the mansion, Margot had been doing more than just stalling Hawthorne. She'd been observing, listening, and formulating a plan that would turn the cattle baron's greatest strength against him. Hawthorne's been so focused on controlling people through fear that he's forgotten the most important rule of tyranny. She explained as Doc Henley gathered his medical bag. "You can only push folks so far before they push back." Over the next hour, Doc Henley became their messenger, moving through the town with his familiar black bag and trusted reputation. At each house, he delivered a simple message. The time had come to reclaim Willowbrook from the tyrant on the hill. The response was overwhelming. Shopkeepers who'd been forced to pay protection money, ranchers who'd seen their spreads confiscated on trumped-up charges, families who'd lived in fear, they all answered the call. By midnight, nearly 100 armed townspeople had gathered in the church. their faces grim with determination. Zeke addressed them from the pulpit, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced death and emerged stronger. "I won't lie to you folks," he said. "Some of us might not see morning. But if we don't stand up now, if we don't fight for what's right, then our children will grow up in a world where men like Hawthorne can do whatever they please to whoever they please." Old Ben Morrison, the blacksmith, raised his hammer. "My boy enlisted to fight in the war, said he was defending freedom. Well, I reckon freedom is something we got to defend right here at home, too." The plan was simple but effective. At dawn, the townspeople would surround Hawthorne's mansion from all directions, cutting off escape routes and forcing the hired guns to surrender or face overwhelming odds. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. But first, they had one more card to play. As the sun rose over Willowbrook, Sheriff Dalton arrived with a company of territorial marshals. Tobias had sent word to the real authorities, and they'd ridden hard through the night to restore order to the lawless town. The sight of federal badges changed everything. Hawthorne's hired guns were professionals, but they weren't stupid. Fighting townspeople was one thing, shooting it out with territorial marshals was a hanging offense. By noon, it was over. Hawthorne found himself in chains, facing charges of corruption, intimidation, fraud, and a dozen other crimes. His hired army scattered to the winds, their contracts worthless with their employer in custody. Standing on the courthouse steps where it had all begun, Zeke held Margot close as the townspeople celebrated their freedom. The money from the poker game would buy them a modest ranch in Oregon Territory, but more importantly, they had each other. Margot said, her head resting against his shoulder. "I think Papa would have been proud of how this turned out." "I think he would have been proud of you," Zeke corrected. "You were the real hero here. All I did was play cards and shoot straight." She laughed, that musical sound that had first captured his heart. "All you did was risk everything you had to save someone you loved. That's the definition of a hero, Ezekiel Brannigan." They married the following spring in the same church where they'd planned their rebellion against tyranny. Doc Henley performed the ceremony, Tobias Ironwood gave away the bride, and half the town attended the reception. As they rode west toward their new life, Margot looked back once at the town they were leaving behind. Willowbrook was free now, its people no longer living in fear. That was a legacy worth more than gold. "Any regrets?" Zeke asked, following her gaze. "Only one," she said with a mischievous smile. "I never did get to see you break that Mustang I was working with when we first met." Zeke laughed and spurred his horse forward. "Well, Mrs. Brannigan, I reckon we've got the rest of our lives too." "Work on that." Behind them, the sun set over Willowbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the colors of freedom, hard won and dearly held.